My son ordered a DNA test to prove I was senile. He sat me down, explained it was for my own good, and swabbed my cheek like I was already too far gone to notice. But when the lab called, they asked for him by a different surname. The surname of my former business partner. That's when I realized the truth had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years, and the one about to be exposed wasn't me. My name is Henry Aldridge. I'm 74 years old, retired, and until last month my biggest concern was whether the tomatoes would ripen before the frost. My son Daniel saw something different. A man slipping. He started talking to lawyers, building a case that I was no longer competent to manage my own life. The DNA test was his final piece of ammunition. Then, the lab technician called his number and asked for a Daniel Marchetti. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 40 years. Vincent Marchetti was my business partner, the man who stole from me, destroyed our company, and vanished. Now his name was inside my own son's blood. To understand how I got to that moment, you have to go back to when I was a man who trusted his best friend with everything. In 1972, Vincent Marchetti and I were two hungry kids from Pittsburgh with more ideas than money. We met in a welding shop where I was working nights, and within an hour of talking I knew two things. The man was brilliant at seeing what other people missed, and I would have followed him anywhere. We started Aldridge Manufacturing together with nothing but handshake and a shared belief that we were building something that would outlast us. For 8 years, that belief was true. We grew from a single rented garage to a 40,000-square-foot facility with 80 employees and contracts across 6 states. We were in each other's weddings. I was the best man at his. His son called me Uncle Henry. There is a photograph somewhere in a box in my attic of Vincent and me standing in front of our first new loading dock, grinning like men who had just discovered the secret that everyone else was too cautious to find. I kept that photograph for decades, even after everything, because it reminded me that the man I trusted was not entirely a fiction. But a fiction is exactly what he was. In 1980, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Purchase orders that I hadn't approved. Client complaints about invoices we never sent. A second set of books that Vincent kept in his office and told me was just for tax planning. He was good at making me feel like the paranoid one. "Henry, you work too hard," he'd say. "Let me handle the details. That's what partners do." And for too long I let him. Because the thought of Vincent betraying me was more painful than the possibility that I was just being foolish. Then came a Thursday morning I will never forget. Our bookkeeper, a quiet woman named Helen, knocked on my office door and sat down with a folder. Her hands were shaking. She handed me copies of wire transfers spanning 3 years, money being siphoned into an account in the Cayman Islands, an account registered to a shell company that led directly back to Vincent. He had been hollowing out the company while I was on the factory floor, shaking hands with workers, believing we were building a legacy. In total, over $500,000. He had also been feeding our proprietary designs to a competitor that he secretly owned. Helen had discovered it by accident while reconciling a payment that didn't match any job. She was terrified he would find out. I told her to go home, take the week off, and not tell anyone. Then I locked my office door and sat with the evidence for 3 hours. I confronted Vincent that evening. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. He just looked at me with a calm I will never forget and said, "You were always too trusting, Henry. That's why I needed you. And that's why I'm leaving." He walked out with the only copy of our original partnership agreement, which I later learned had a hidden clause that allowed him to sell his share to a third party under certain conditions. The conditions were fraudulent, but by the time my lawyers could move, he had already liquidated his stake through a shell and disappeared. The company collapsed within 6 months. 80 people lost their livelihoods. I lost everything I had built: my savings, my reputation, and a friendship that had shaped my entire adult life. Vincent Marchetti vanished. Some people said he moved to Florida. Others whispered about South America. I didn't pursue him. I was 37, bankrupt, and so full of rage I couldn't trust myself to do the right thing. So I did nothing. I returned to working with my hands, repairing industrial machinery, living in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and slowly, painfully, rebuilding my sense of what a man could be. Then I met Margaret. She was a nurse at the clinic where I went after a work accident, and she had a way of looking at me that made me feel less like a failure and more like a work in progress. We married in 1985. Daniel was born 2 years later. I didn't think about Vincent Marchetti for whole stretches of time. I became a father. I coached Little League. I fixed bicycle chains and taught Daniel how to read a balance sheet because he asked. Margaret and I were happy in the quiet, stubborn way that two people who have been through separate storms can be happy together. When she passed away from ovarian cancer in 2011, a part of me shut down, but Daniel was my anchor. He was 24, sharp, ambitious. He had his mother's resolve, and, I thought, my conscience. But something shifted after Margaret died. Daniel started treating me less like a father and more like a liability. He began questioning my memory, pointing out small mistakes, misplacing documents, and then asking if I remembered putting them there. It was subtle at first, a comment about gray hair, a suggestion that I get a checkup. Then it became more pointed. He wanted to manage my finances. He wanted to review my will. He started bringing over legal papers, always framed as concern, always with that same tilted smile. "Dad, I just want to protect you," he'd say. "You're not as sharp as you used to be." Last year, he convinced my doctor to order a cognitive assessment. I passed it without a single issue. But Daniel told everyone the results were inconclusive. He hired a lawyer who specialized in guardianship cases. The word incompetence started showing up in conversations I was not invited to. And then, 2 months ago, he showed up at my house with a DNA testing kit and said he needed to confirm our biological relationship for a health history report he was compiling. He said it so casually, like asking to borrow a hammer. But his eyes didn't match his tone. They were measuring me, cataloging, waiting for me to slip. I agreed, because I wanted to see where this was going. I let him swab my cheek. I let him place the sample in the envelope and seal it in front of me. I even let him mail it. What I did not let him know was that for the first time in 40 years, I had heard the name Vincent Marchetti only a week before. A retired colleague had called to tell me a man matching Vincent's description had been spotted in the city, and that he had been asking about me. The timing was impossible to ignore. The lab took 3 weeks to process the results. On the day they called, I was sitting on my porch, watching the tomatoes turn. Daniel's number lit up my phone, but it wasn't his voice. It was a woman from the lab, polite, clinical, she said. "We're trying to reach Mr. Daniel Marchetti regarding his DNA test. Is this a good contact number?" I held the phone against my chest for a full 10 seconds before I answered. Vincent Marchetti's surname had just walked back into my life through my own son's blood. And I knew, in that moment, that the test Daniel had ordered to bury me was about to dig up a grave he didn't even know existed. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice flat. "This is Henry Aldridge. I believe there's been a mistake with the sample submission. Can you tell me why you're calling my son Daniel a Marchetti?" There was a pause on the other end, papers rustling, a muffled consultation. Then the lab technician returned, hesitant now. "Sir, our system flagged a genetic match between the sample labeled Daniel Aldridge and a sample previously submitted by a Vincent Marchetti. We were trying to reach the donor to verify his identity before releasing results. The paternity match is conclusive. The biological father of the tested individual is Vincent Marchetti, not the second sample provided." She said the words like she was reading a weather report. I wrote them down carefully on the back of a grocery receipt, my handwriting steady, my chest a hollow room. She offered to send the full report to the address on file. I gave her my email. When the PDF arrived, I sat at my kitchen table and read it 6 times. The probability of paternity was 99.99%. The lab had cross-referenced Daniel's sample with a genetic profile that Vincent Marchetti had donated to a medical research study 15 years earlier. Vincent had used his real name. He must have believed he was so completely hidden that no one would ever connect the dots. But someone did. The lab's computer did. And now I held the proof. I thought about Margaret. Her laugh, her hands, the way she tucked her chin when she was lying about something small, like whether she'd eaten the last cookie. I thought about the summer of 1986, when she took a sudden trip to visit a sick aunt I'd never met. I didn't question it. She came back quieter. I told myself it was grief for her aunt. The aunt, I later learned, had died 2 years earlier. Margaret had been gone for 9 days, and I never once allowed myself to wonder. Vincent Marchetti had not simply vanished into the wind. He had crept back into my life through the one door I never bolted. The man who hollowed out my company had hollowed out my marriage. And the child I raised, the boy I taught to throw a curveball and drive a stick shift, was not mine. He was Vincent's. The thought landed not like a blow, but like a slow, freezing tide. I felt no anger at first, only a vast, silent stillness, the kind that comes when the last piece of a puzzle you refuse to finish finally locks into place. I called the lab again the next morning and asked if I could come in. I told them I was Vincent Marchetti's former attorney, which was not true, but I needed to see the underlying data. The lab was in a low concrete building on the edge of town, the kind of place that smells of antiseptic and toner. A woman named Rosa met me at the front desk. She was maybe 50, with tired eyes and the sort of permanent compassion that comes from delivering hard news for a living. I didn't have a single piece of fake identification, but I had something better. I told her the truth. I said, "Rosa, my name is Henry Aldridge. The man who submitted his Dina as the presumed father in that test is me. Daniel is my son. I raised him. I loved him. But the biological father on that report was my business partner. The man who destroyed everything I built, and he did it again. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I need to understand what happened before I decide what any of this means." Rosa looked at me for a long moment. Her expression didn't change, but her hand moved to the phone and pushed it aside. She pulled a tissue from a box on the counter and didn't hand it to me. She just placed it within reach. She led me to a small conference room and pulled up the raw data on her laptop. The Dina segments that locked Daniel to Vincent were spread across 16 chromosomes, an unbroken chain of genetic inheritance that left zero room for doubt. She cross-referenced the dates of sample collection. Vincent's specimen had been taken in 2008, 3 years before Margaret died. Part of a university study on early-onset cognitive decline that he'd enrolled in under his own name. That meant Vincent was alive, may still be alive, living somewhere close enough to walk into a research clinic and give blood. But the detail that made my hands go cold was not Vincent's Dina. It was a medical history file Rosa found attached to Daniel's sample. Daniel had ordered the test, not just for a simple paternity check. but as part of a comprehensive genetic screening for dementia risk factors. He had told the lab that he was concerned about his father's cognitive decline and wanted to see if he himself was at risk. The test I thought was a weapon to destroy my competence was, in Daniel's mind, a legitimate health precaution. He genuinely believed I was fading. And he genuinely did not know who his actual father was. Rosa printed copies of everything and placed them in a plain manila envelope. She didn't ask for payment. She didn't ask me to sign anything. She just said, "Mr. Aldridge, I've seen a lot of families come apart in this building. And I've learned that the truth doesn't go away if you wait. It just gets heavier. Whatever you do, don't wait too long." I folded the envelope into my jacket, and when I walked out into the parking lot, the sun was too bright and the birds were singing like nothing at all had shifted. Over the next week, I did what I do best. I gathered evidence. I dug through old tax records that Margaret had kept in a cedar chest. I found a bank statement from a joint account she had opened in her maiden name. Statements showing cash deposits made in 1987. Just before Daniel was born, deposits that matched the amounts of money Vincent had stolen from our company. I found a photograph tucked inside a book of poetry she never opened. Margaret and Vincent at a restaurant I didn't recognize. His arm around her shoulder, her smile a version I had never been given. The ink on the back was faded, October 1986. The start of something true. That photograph was the hardest moment. Not because I discovered betrayal. I already knew that. But because I could see in Margaret's face a kind of happiness I had never been able to give her. Vincent had taken something from me a third time. Not just my money, not just my company, but the quiet assurance that my wife had chosen me with her whole heart. I sat on the floor of my bedroom with that photograph in my hand, and I allowed myself 15 minutes of grief. Then I stood up, washed my face, and went back to the kitchen table. Daniel called that same evening. He was preparing for the competency hearing, which he'd scheduled for the 3rd of September. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who has practiced what he's about to say. "Dad, I've asked Dr. Peterson to testify about the cognitive assessment. He thinks it would be best if you just attended. Don't prepare anything. I'll do all the talking. We just want what's best for you." I let the silence stretch between us until he cleared his throat. "Daniel," I said quietly, "are you absolutely sure there isn't something you need to tell me before we stand in front of a judge?" He paused. A half beat too long. "What do you mean?" I let out a slow breath and said, "Nothing. We'll talk in court." And I hung up. The game had changed. I was no longer the feeble old man he was trying to sideline. I was the only person in the world who knew that the weapon he'd loaded against me was pointed directly at his own chest. The question was no longer whether I could protect myself. The question was whether I could protect him from the truth I now held. And the answer to that question was going to reshape everything we thought we were. The phone went dead in my hand, but the weight of that silence was nothing compared to the question I had just planted in his ear. Daniel was not a stupid man. He would replay that sentence 100 times before the hearing, and eventually the doubt would sprout. I couldn't control what he did with that doubt, but I could be ready for every possible answer. I spent the next morning at the county records office. The building smelled of old paper and floor wax, and the clerk behind the counter was a young man with the weary helpfulness of someone who has been asked too many strange questions and stopped judging them years ago. I asked for business filings from the mid-1980s, marriage records, death certificates, anything that might trace Vincent Marchetti's shadow across my life after he disappeared. The clerk handed me a stack of microfiche and pointed to a dusty reader in the corner. For 3 hours, I scrolled through contracts, liens, and court dockets. Vincent had covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. There was a chain of LLCs, each registered in a different state, all tied to a single address, a post office box in Coral Gables, Florida, and then buried in a 2003 filing for a medical supply company. A phone number that matched the one Daniel had called me from 2 years ago, when he said he was visiting a college friend in Miami. I copied the number, closed the microfiche drawer, and walked outside into the afternoon heat. The pieces were already locking together, and I didn't want them to. Vincent had been in Daniel's life, not as a ghost, not as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing presence. The man who helped hollow out my company had also helped raise my son, all while I believed I was the only father Daniel had ever known. I hired a private investigator the next day. His name was Tom's, a retired detective with the kind of patient stillness that makes you want to confess things. I gave him the Florida address, the phone number, the photograph of Margaret and Vincent. I told him nothing about the DNA test. I just said, I need to know who this man is to my son, and I need to know before September 3rd. Tom's looked at the photograph, then at me, and didn't ask the question that was clearly forming behind his eyes. He just nodded and said, I'll call you in 4 days. 4 days later, Tom's rang my doorbell at 7 in the morning. I made him coffee, and he spread a folder across my kitchen table with the care of a surgeon. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and phone records. Vincent Marchetti was alive, living under the name Victor Manning, in a retirement community 60 miles from my house. He had moved there 3 years ago, shortly after Margaret died, claiming he wanted to be close to old friends. Tom's had tracked his phone calls, weekly conversations, with a number registered to Daniel Aldridge. Regular deposits into a trust account that Daniel had set up for estate planning. And, most devastating, a series of emails between Vincent and a lawyer named Geraldine Shaw. The same Geraldine Shaw who was representing Daniel in the competency hearing. The emails were cordial, professional. Geraldine had been hired on the recommendation of a family friend. That friend was Vincent. The emails discussed strategy for the hearing, how to frame my supposed cognitive decline, and how to ensure that once guardianship was granted, Daniel would have full control over my assets. There was no mention of Vincent's biological relationship to Daniel, but there was a phrase in one message that made my blood stop. Once HA is removed, we can finally make things right after 40 years. HA. That was me, Henry Aldridge. And make things right could only mean one thing. Vincent intended to use my son to reclaim what he believed I had stolen from him all those decades ago. Daniel was not just a pawn, he was the weapon. I closed the folder and looked at Tom's. Does Daniel know any of this? Tom's shook his head slowly. From what I could gather, your son believes he's acting on medical advice. He has no idea that the legal strategy is being coordinated by Vincent Manning. As far as Daniel is concerned, Vincent is just a distant family acquaintance who offered to help with the paperwork when Margaret died. The connection is deep enough to be useful, but shallow enough to remain invisible. I nodded and poured more coffee. The silence in my kitchen was heavy, but clear. I now had the truth, and I had a choice. Over the next 2 weeks, I prepared. I did not hire a lawyer of my own. I trusted no one with what I knew. Instead, I assembled a binder, meticulous, indexed, tabbed, with every piece of evidence. The DNA lab report, the bank statements from Margaret's secret account, the photograph, Tom's investigation, the emails between Vincent and Geraldine Shaw. I made copies and stored them in a safety deposit box, and I wrote a letter to Daniel, sealed in an envelope, to be opened only after the hearing. In it, I told him the entire truth, from Vincent's theft of my company to the moment I learned he was not my biological son. I ended the letter with a single sentence: I will always be your father, even if you weren't always my son. The night before the hearing, I drove to Vincent's retirement community. It was a sprawling complex of beige stucco and palm trees, the kind of place where old men go to wait out their final years in golf courses and gossip. I found his unit, a ground-floor apartment with a wheelchair ramp and a hibiscus bush by the door. I knocked. A woman answered, a caregiver with a thick Caribbean accent. She told me Mr. Manning was in the garden. I walked around back and saw him there, sitting in a folding chair, a blanket over his knees despite the mild evening. Vincent Marchetti, the man who had destroyed my first partnership, stolen my wife's heart, and now sought to use my son to finish a 40-year-old grudge. He looked up at me, and for a long moment there was no recognition. Then his eyes narrowed, and a thin smile crossed his face. It was the same smile he'd worn when he walked out of my office in 1980. Henry, he said. His voice was raspy, diminished by age and illness. I wondered when you'd find your way here. I didn't sit. I just stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets. I know everything, I said quietly. The affair, the money, the way you've been guiding Daniel's hand against me. I have evidence, Vincent, enough to end you, if I wanted. He didn't flinch. Instead, he looked down at his hands, spotted with age, and said, I'm dying, Henry, pancreatic cancer. I've got maybe 6 months. You want to destroy me? Go ahead. There's nothing you can take from me I haven't already lost. Then he lifted his eyes, and in them I saw not triumph, but a deep, hollow exhaustion. But Daniel is my son, my only son. I just wanted to know him before I go. I wanted to give him something, and the only thing you ever gave him was your shadow to stand in. I felt a surge of anger rise in my throat, and I let it sit there before swallowing it down. You've been lying to him, using him. You're not giving him anything. You're turning him into the same kind of man you were. Vincent's smile flickered and died. Maybe, but I can't undo the past. I can only try to make the future right. Daniel thinks he's protecting you. He believes it. If you tell him the truth, you'll destroy him. So what's it going to be, Henry? Are you going to save your name, or are you going to save your son? That was the real weapon, not the DNA test, not the legal case, but the fact that the man who had caused all my suffering was now asking me to choose between my dignity and my child's peace of mind. I looked at Vincent for another long moment, then turned and walked away. He called after me, something I didn't catch, but I didn't slow down. The next morning, I put on my cleanest shirt and a tie that Margaret had given me for a long-ago anniversary. I drove to the county courthouse, past the sycamore trees shedding their leaves, past the coffee shop where Daniel and I used to get hot chocolate when he was small enough to still hold my hand. The hearing was scheduled for 9:30. I arrived an hour early and sat on the bench outside the courtroom, the binder of evidence resting on my lap like a loaded gun. Daniel appeared at 9:15, accompanied by Geraldine Shaw. He looked pale and drawn, his suit expensive but rumpled, as though he'd slept in it. When he saw me, he hesitated. For a moment, I saw the boy I had raised, the one who cried at dog movies and once defended a classmate from a bully by standing in front of him with no idea how to fight. "Dad," he said. His voice was soft, confused. "What are you doing here so early?" I stood. "I came to tell you something, Daniel, before we walk into that room. I'm going to let this hearing happen. I'm going to let you say everything you've prepared. And then, when it's my turn, I'm going to show you and this court something that will change everything. But before I do, I want you to know, no matter what you learn today, I am proud of you. I am proud of the man you became. And I always will be." His face registered shock, then fear. He turned to Geraldine, who was watching me with narrowed, calculating eyes. She knew I had something, and she didn't like it. "Mr. Aldridge," she started, "if you have evidence to present, you're required to submit it in advance." I nodded agreeably and tapped the binder. "Oh, I have copies. For everyone. You'll get yours when the time comes." The bailiff called us in. The courtroom was small and quiet, the judge an older woman with sharp eyes and the air of someone who had seen every family trick in the book. Daniel testified first. He spoke about my forgetfulness, my stubbornness, the time I left the stove on overnight, the way I sometimes called him by the dog's name. His voice cracked with what sounded like genuine concern, and I realized he really did believe I was slipping. He had been fed small truths twisted into a narrative, and he was the most dangerous kind of believer, a sincere one. Then Geraldine called Dr. Peterson to discuss the cognitive test I had passed without issue, but which they now framed as inconclusive due to patient coaching. I sat quietly, taking notes, waiting. When they were finished, the judge turned to me and said, "Mr. Aldridge, do you wish to present your own testimony or call witnesses?" I rose from my chair, binder in hand. "Your Honor, I am not here to argue about my mental capacity. I am here to present evidence that this petition for guardianship is based on a fundamental misunderstanding, one that goes back 40 years and involves a man who is not in this room but whose fingerprints are all over this case." I opened the binder and removed the first document, the DNA lab report. Daniel's face went white. "This is a DNA test my son ordered to prove I was senile," I said. But the lab called him by a different name. The name of his biological father, a man named Vincent Marchetti. A man who stole my company, had an affair with my late wife, and has been secretly guiding this legal proceeding to finally destroy me. "Daniel, I am sorry to tell you this way, but you are not my biological son." The courtroom erupted. Geraldine Shaw stood up, her mouth open, but the judge slammed her gavel. Daniel stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, as the truth began its slow, terrible work. I placed the photograph on the table, then the bank statements, then Tom's investigation report, and then I turned to my son, the boy I raised, and said the only thing left to say: "Everything you thought you were doing for my protection was a lie planted in your heart by the man who wanted to destroy me. And I don't blame you. I never will. But now you have to decide. Are you his son, or are you mine?" In the weeks that followed, I visited Vincent one more time. I didn't bring anger. I brought the photograph of Margaret, the one with the faded ink that said the start of something true. I placed it on his nightstand and said, "She loved you. I don't know if that makes it better or worse, but it's the truth. And you gave me a son. You gave me the best part of my life, even if you never meant to." Vincent stared at the picture. His eyes were wet, and for the first time, he had nothing to say. He died 6 weeks later. I went to the funeral alone, stood at the back, and when it was over I left a single tomato from my garden on the ground near his headstone. Not as forgiveness, I'm not that evolved, but as a marker that something had finally ended. Daniel and I have spent the years since that courtroom rebuilding what was never fully broken, just bent. He still calls me Dad. I still answer. We don't talk much about Vincent, but we don't avoid him either. Some truths settle into the foundation of a relationship, not as cracks, but as patches that make the whole thing stronger. He took over my finances, not because a judge ordered it, but because I asked him to. My memory isn't what it was, and that's not a defeat, just a fact. The tomatoes still ripen. The truck still starts. And when Daniel comes over for dinner now, we sit at the same table where I first told him the truth, and we talk about the future. There's a version of this story where I let the anger win, where I burn everything down and walk away vindicated but alone. I chose a different path, not because I'm noble, but because I've spent 74 years learning that the people you love will always be imperfect, and the only thing you can control is what you do with that knowledge. My son ordered a DNA test to prove I was senile. Instead, it proved something else. That fatherhood isn't biology. It's showing up. It's staying. It's looking at a young man who was handed a weapon and choosing to see him as a person who was just as lost as you were. If this story meant something to you, do the one thing that keeps these stories alive: hit that like button and subscribe. Most people never do. But it's the only way this community grows. Drop a comment if you've ever had to forgive the unforgivable. I read them. And remember, the people in these stories had every chance to do the right thing. Sometimes they choose wrong. And sometimes, just sometimes, they find their way back.